season. We're very delighted to have you here. I have a couple of housekeeping issues. The membership for the Historical Society is now June to June. If you put in your money now, it'll go till June next year. You don't have to wait until June. We have some forms here. We have a lot of miscellaneous expenses, and our membership is what supports those. So please consider, it's $15 for a person, $25 for a family. Won't break the bank. And we have some books and some brochures and stuff over here that you can look at when this is over. A couple of our coffee mugs. If you have any questions or anything about the Historical Society, just let me know. I also wanted to tell you that we have a new park ranger at the Gorey Museum, Stephen Ruffin, and he just got assigned permanently and exclusively to the Gorey Museum, and he is so excited. He is going to turn it into the most wonderful little tiny museum that there ever was. And he has a background in marketing or supply chain for Little Debbie. And he went working from home during the pandemic and sold his house up north and moved to Port St. Joe, and then they told him to come back. And he said, so now he's our new park ranger, so I'm really glad to have him. Rebecca Dolan is a botanist, and she now lives on St. George Island. She's been visiting the county for quite a long time. She's originally from Michigan, where she got her undergraduate degree. Then she moved south and got her Ph.D. at the University of Florida. Georgia, in botany.
Go Dogs.
Also. Yeah. And she ran the herbarium at Butler University in Indianapolis for 30 years.
Also Go Dogs.
Yeah. Go Dogs.
There's a team.
Yeah. She's written over 35 articles on botanical history. Well, she ranges more away from the botanical for evaluation of land use and all kinds of things like that. So she's got a great collection of stuff. She moved to the island in 2012. Her husband's name is Tom. Is he here? No.
We don't go to each other's talks.
And she is also one of the people, and I think there are several other in the room, who are putting together a more active Chapman Botanical Garden Committee. So I thank you all for your involvement with that. And I will turn it over to Heather.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie. It's good to be here. This is my second talk in front of a live audience in 5 years since I retired. So rusty, but we'll see how it goes. But I'm happy to be here to share the story about Alvin Chapman and share what resonates with my botanist soul about him and his life. And botany, I have to say, is a fantastic vocation. I don't feel like I'm retired because it's a great avocation too. So I'm happy to be here to share with you about Apalachicola's Alvin Chapman. I will start being here too.
Oh, let's turn the lights.
Perfect, except for me.
Oh, can you not see the?
I will when my eyes adjust, but it's not advancing. So see, we don't have time. Maybe my computer. We'll see. But so the main significant contribution of Alvin Chapman to the world of botany that endures through to this day is an amazing work that he put together here on the frontier in Apalachicola in the middle 1800s. And this was a flora for the southern United States, and it was the first flora of this region. So we're focusing on how he came to be here and how he came to write this book. So as an overview of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about Chapman's life and times in Apalachicola, which many of you are much more familiar with than me. Talk about Chapman's publications, for which he had a very few botanical publications in botany journals, and published his book, so we'll be able to talk about all of those publications today. Then, from his work, Chapman discovered a lot of plants that were new to science and wrote the first descriptions of them. So I'm going to explain. I told Katie this is some of my favorite stuff is this arcane way in which plants are named, and the paper trail and history that allows you to go back to the very beginning and trace the first person that applied the name to a plant and see a sample, a specimen of the plant that name was applied to. So talk through that and then finish up with some reminiscence of Chapman's from his letters and from obituary tributes that were written to him that kind of stood out to me and resonated with me across the centuries of a botanist's soul. So, brief overview of Chapman's life. He was born, wasn't Southerner, was a Yankee, born in Massachusetts, got a degree at Amherst in the classics, and then moved south to tutor and teach in Georgia. He earned a medical degree from Medical College in Louisville, Kentucky. And as near as I can tell, he attended some lectures and perhaps did some classes there, but I think he did a lot of training under the mentorship of another doctor, as the way that training went in those days, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, Heather. But he moved to our area, to Quincy in 1835, and then on here to Appalach in 1847. Lived to be 90 years old. This is an excellent tribute to a life as a botanist too. And he's buried in Chestnut Cemetery. And then I know you history buffs will know that this was really the frontier back in those days. The U.S. got Florida from Spain in 1821, and Florida didn't even achieve statehood until 1845. So what I know about Chapman and Apalachicola, I learned a lot from important references like this newsletter from the Society here, from a wonderful book by Gail Fishman. I don't know how many of you have read this. I totally recommend it. She has a chapter in there about Chapman. And also from many people in this room who have contributed articles to the Apalachicola Times. So this is what first made me aware of Chapman and got me kind of interested in his history here, that he was here in Apalachicola. So also learned about his being here by seeing the memorial plaque and coming to recognize that this was his house, you know, in Apalachicola. It's on the corner of 98 right, and 6th Street. And although I'd gotten my degree at Georgia and did field work in South Carolina and worked for many years with a colleague doing genetic studies of rare plants of the Lake Wales Ridge in central peninsular Florida, I knew of Chapman, and I knew he'd written an early Flora of the South, but I didn't understand the significance of it or know that he had been here in Apalachicola until this sign was put up in 2012. So the Chapman House is still there. There were efforts for a while, you know, to turn it into a museum for Chapman, but it's under different ownership now that's private. And it's not a museum, you can't get into the house, but this is the carriage house, view from the carriage house, You see the Chapman house in the background. If you want to get close to this facility, you can rent out this beautiful carriage house. So I don't know how long the carriage house was there, if it was original to the time when Chapman was there or not. I'm sorry to keep walking. But in Chapman Cemetery, kind of right behind the Chapman house, there is their grave markers for Chapman and his wife. And it reads, Alvin Wentworth Chapman, the eminent botanist whose writings and research on the flora of the South met with distinguished recognition at home and abroad. And so it's a nice tribute to him. Chapman and his wife, I believe, had a daughter who died young. But his wife had been married before, and she had a couple of daughters from her first marriage. And in my readings, Chapman kind of adopted them as his own daughters, and he left his estate to them. Back to the cover of his Flora of the Southern States. You may have noticed, those astute among you, that his first name was spelled differently in different references. And this kind of confused me for a while. Sometimes it's A-L-V-A-N, and sometimes it's A-L-V-I-N. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I wondered why there'd be such disparity. And then I realized that when he published papers, he just used his initials. So I think people were used to either just calling him Dr. Chapman, or else only knew him by his initials. So I found some of his correspondence that's online now. And this is a letter, I'll talk about it a little bit more later, that he wrote to Torrey, a distinguished botanist in New York, where he was working on developing his understanding of the plants, and he signed it here, and it's A-L-V-A-N is how he signed his name, so I figured he should know. So that's what it is. So other tributes or dedications to Chapman's memory here in Apalachicola are the Chapman Botanical Gardens, which are at the Orman House Historic State Park. This was dedicated in the 1980s, and recently they put up a new sign with more information about Chapman and his background to explain the history of the garden. You know, there's Chapman School and Auditorium. Chapman was a well-respected member of the community during his 60-plus years here. He was the president of the school board. He was active with Trinity Episcopal Church. He was the customs collector for a while, which was a very important position in the city. And the school, first Chapman School, there have been 3 or 4, right, was named even before, in his honor, even before he passed away. There's Chapman Square in the city, where the tennis courts are, Avenue D and, I can't read 14th Street. So, Chapman's major contributions to botany, both historical and ongoing, are his publications, the plants he named as new to science, which was more than 400, and I'll explain why that was possible while I was working here on the frontier. And not all those names are still in use, but also there are plants that have been named in his honor, and there are at least 16 of those that I'm aware of. So his very first publication in botany was in a journal here in 1845, and this was published in the Western Journal of Medicine and Surgery. And this kind of had me confused for a little bit at first. I thought, well, that's interesting that he's publishing there. I wondered maybe if he was interested in medicinal plants that might be used for herbal remedies or for his own compounding of drugs. But I haven't found any evidence of that. But it turns out this journal was published in Louisville by the same institution where he got his medical degree. So I was thinking perhaps that's what led him to choose this outlet to publish in. But This first publication was, just as it says, a list of plants growing spontaneously. So that means outside of cultivation. These are wild plants. That's what he was interested in the vicinity of Quincy, Florida. And the flora of that area was so unknown that just publishing a list of the things that he saw there was considered a significant contribution. His next publication in a journal was a dedicated botanical journal, Botanical Gazette, and this was additions to his flora. It says, the enumeration of some plants, chiefly from the semi-tropic regions of Florida, which are new or have not hitherto been included as belonging in the flora of the southern states. And here he named species, but it wasn't just a list, it has descriptions of the species and the kind of habitats they grow in and when they flower. This is a whole other topic for a whole other lecture, but Chapman wrote about his experiences with Hardy Kroon, who was the person who first collected Torreya. So this is a very rare plant. It's an evergreen conifer that has an interesting story behind it. Like I said, the details for another day. But Chapman had this incredible map in the paper that shows our area, if you can see it, the Apalachicola River north up towards the Georgia line. And it's in these steep ravines that the Torreyas grow. I noticed you have one planted outside the Historical Society here. And this hatching indicated the density of the trees along the tributaries of the creeks that fed in there. But back to his major opus. It's still available. You can get it on Amazon, reprinted version of it. And I brought along a original copy of the second edition I got from the Butler Library, so I'm not going to pass it around. I'm going to hold it up here. Keep an eye on it if you want to come up and see it after we're done talking. Or I'm done talking. So why was this volume, the Flora of the Southern United States, so important? Well, it was, as I mentioned, originally published in 1860. And it was the first comprehensive treatment of the flora of the South. Amazingly, Chapman was able to collaborate with the best botanists in America from this remote frontier area. Right? He collaborated with Asa Gray of Harvard and John Torrey, the state botanist in New York. And many people are familiar, if you grew up in the Northeast at all, with Gray's Manual. That's how it's kind of abbreviated. Gray wrote a manual on the flora of the northeastern United States, which was viewed as the most significant work for that area, and he's thought to be the botanist that really unified the taxonomic knowledge of plants of North America and the father of American botany. So after the Civil War, Chapman was able to publish 2 more editions of his book. And another flora for the southeastern United States wasn't published until 1933. So when Chapman was first in Georgia, he says was when he first kind of got an interest in botany. He studied, remember, the classics at Amherst. And I don't know if botany would have been covered in a classical studies curriculum back in the day, but he certainly didn't specialize in the sciences at all. So he would have been teaching himself what plants were by getting a guide or a book with, I think, no pictures, and reading through, or illustrations, reading through all the detailed keys to figure out what things were. And the book that was available to him at the time for that area was published in 1818 by Eaton, and it covered the northern and middle states, which it says is descriptions of the plants to the north of Virginia with reference to the natural order of plants. But anyway, there was not anything that covered this part of the United States. And then Gray from Harvard published his manual, 1848, on the botany of the northern states. And Chapman greatly admired this book, the layout of it, how it was put together. So he modeled his Flora of the southern states after Asa Gray's work. And I read that Chapman wanted to restrict his flora to just like Florida and Georgia and South Carolina, where he had the most experience, and that Gray talked him into expanding to cover what at the time were was considered the southern United States, not just the southeastern United States, but the southern United States. So his book covered all of Tennessee, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. So I don't think he field collected in all those areas, but he tried to identify plants that were growing throughout these entire southern states. He shows a little bit of the old teacher in him and tutor. In the book, at the beginning section, is an introduction on the elements of botany, and it's like a little botany textbook that tells you about botany terms and the different characteristics and features of plants. Mentioned that there wasn't another manual published of the flora until 1933 by Small. And when I was in graduate school, we used to joke that the Small's manual was not small, because if you put it on its side, it's like, you know, an old phone book. It was inches thick and not something that you could easily bring with you in the field. But it took Small this much space to cover the flora when he had tackled it. So, to me, and it's amazing to me that Chapman in this remote area was able to connect with these very influential best botanists in America and some of the best in the world from this remote site, and put together a flora that covered this area that was so botanically unknown. And part of the reason that it continues to be an important legacy is that I think it's a little bit underappreciated that we here in the southeastern United States are in an area of global biodiversity. So if you look along, you know, the entire state of Florida and coastal Atlantic and Gulf states are areas that rank in Conservation International list of global hotspots. And another way to look at this is these 9 hotspots. I think we've got a fair amount of land conserved here in Franklin County right now, but this is a paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2015, and it shows priority areas in the country. And there's, you know, a lot of rare and important plants and animals out in the Pacific coast, but big concentration in the southeastern United States. And one of the hottest areas on the heat map here is 5, which is, we're quite close, Florida Panhandle. Okay, so this is an area of a high concentration of rare plants and animals. And they called out for the plants a lot of woody species, trees and shrubs that are not found anywhere else, as well as numbers of amphibians here. Another way to look at this idea is that there are a lot of plants found only in this area is this map, which these isobars are telling you concentrations of endemic species. Those are ones found only in a specific region. And you can see there's a concentration along the Lake Wales Ridge in peninsular Florida, but there's a huge concentration in our area, which is on the map, the Apalachicola region of the Florida Panhandle. And it might be hard for me to read this off screen. The high concentration of endemics in this region, the paper said that previous chart went with, said, is manifest in Liberty and Franklin counties. Franklin County contains 53 rare southeastern endemics, whereas Liberty holds 55. And together, these two counties contain 74 different endemic species. Thus, almost 20% of the rare southeastern endemics have at least one occurrence in either or both of these counties. So, one last thing about why the flora here is so rich and interesting is part of it is the rare plants that you only find here, but part of it also is species reaching the edges of their distributions here. So we have northern plants from the Appalachians that reach the southern edge of their distributions, some of them like up in the Seeps area. We have Atlantic coastal plain species that kind of curl around from the Atlantic coast to the Gulf Coast. There are remnants of the western flora that over the eons when sea level was rising and falling and the coasts were changing, there was a migration of flora from the west into the Panhandle region. And there were also the northern terminus of species that are found in peninsular flora. So there's just a big number of plants around here. So back to Chapman and his flora. Now I'm going to segue a little bit into talking about plants and plant names. So I said he named over 400 plants new to science. And you can see there's a lot of plants out there that people have not discovered because there hasn't been that much plant exploration going on in this remote frontier area. So here are 3 examples of plants that were named by Chapman. And this is the formal presentation of the scientific name over on the left side. And so it's been a while since you had that high school or college botany class. I will review briefly that the formal presentation of the scientific name has the genus name first. And each genus name is used only once for a particular group of plants. For some reason, this presentation of scientific names always confuses people, and it's not really that complicated. The second word in the scientific name is a specific epithet, or that which comes later, right? So specific epithets can be used more than once. For example, white oak is Quercus alba, but Chapman named this McBridia species McBridia alba. So you can use the specific epithets multiple times in different combinations to indicate different species. And sometimes they tell you something about the plant, like that it might be originally, it has small flowers, part of a folia, but it doesn't have to. The person that names it can call it anything they want. So you put the 2 together and that's the species name. Genus and specific epithet. So then what is the Chapman part? That's the author or authority of the plant name. So this is the person that first, this is the plant in the top, Xyris deformis, as described by Chapman. And because we have a history of where it was first described, we can go back and see what Chapman had in mind when he first coined the species name Xyris deformis. And people who named a lot of plants get an abbreviation for their name, and so that's why Chapman is abbreviated here. So the acceptance of new names, this is sort of the arcane part here, but it's both fluid and dynamic, but there's also, it's very codified and prescribed by the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature. And I think maybe back up for a second. I might have double put this slide here. I did. Steps for naming a plant new to science. Okay. Has to be published in a journal or other medium. In Chapman's case, that was his Flora. Okay. Has to be accompanied by a description of the features that the author sees that he or she feels makes it distinct enough to be its own new species. Okay. The author identifies a type specimen and deposits it in a recognized herbarium somewhere in the world. And this type specimen is the one that the person is saying, this specimen has the traits that I'm describing and giving this new name to. And specimens are preserved and can be around for hundreds of years. So how many of you have ever been to a herbarium? A couple people. It sounds like it might have something to do with culinary herbs or something like that, but it's just the Latin word for plant. So it's a plant museum, a plant library. And specimens are pressed and preserved with important label information so that it helps you to know what was growing where when. Because the information that's on the label is the name of the plant, who collected it, where it was collected, the date it was collected, and other information that might be included, like details of the habitat or co-occurring species. And these plants are pressed and dried and mounted on a standard size paper so they can be stored in cabinets, kind of like books in the library. You can retrieve them, and I'll show you a few pictures coming up. Some of the rules indicate that each taxon or each plant has only one valid or legitimate name. Priority is given to the first name used if more than one has been applied, because you can imagine back in the day when people were describing plants and publishing names, and we didn't have centralized access to digitized information, that things might have gotten more than one name. And there's a paper trail then through publications and herbarium specimens that can be annotated to give you the history of the site, of the plant names. So back to this. So someone like Chapman publishes a new plant name. I think this is a plant new to science. And they publish that. And maybe a couple of editors in the journal agreed with them, so they publish it. But the way that the plants names come into use is if others find the evidence presented by the author compelling. They use it, and then that plant name becomes in common use. So this leads to a debate and argument among some botanists about what the best name is for any plant. Some of them, people argue about what features should be distinctive enough to indicate that a plant is a different species from a related species. So there's no one overall authority. These are some some sites with well-vetted plant names for whom the experts in the world in that plant group have weighed in on their opinion. But it changes, it's in flux all the time as people get different concepts of what the boundaries on variation within a species should be, or when new techniques become available, like DNA sequencing, to look at relationship between plants. So it's fluid and dynamic, which is kind of interesting, but also frustrating to people who've learned a plant by one name only to buy a new book and find that scientists or botanists are using a different name to refer to the same plant. So let's just talk through an example of this with Chapman's bog yellowgrass, the Xyris deformis. And I chose this one both because it was kind of a clean story to follow it through. It's not a very photogenic plant at all, but it also illustrates something else I want to mention, which is most of the plants that Chapman described have very limited distribution and are found only in the immediate counties around here, or maybe only in Florida or southern Georgia. But sometimes he was able to pick out distinctive differences in a plant that had a distribution across this wide range that surely had been well botanized by all those New York botanists and others, and yet he was able to distinguish differences that still stand up today, and named a plant that had a really wide distribution. So it wasn't just that he was in an area no one else had been, so everything he named, was new. Sometimes he worked in other areas. So in Chapman's Flora, he first describes this Xyris deformis, and he's got a very detailed description of the plant and also other Xyrises, so you can see why it's different. He calls it a new species, or a species novum, meaning that it doesn't have an authority name after it yet, and he published it in his Flora. From Small's Flora, remember the next one, 80 years later, he agreed that Chapman's treatment of Xyris deformis was a legitimate good species, and so it was picked up and used. And it's still used today, as I was saying. In the Flora of North America, the most definitive treatment of the family that this genus is in cites Chapman as the author, and it mentions the source of that, the Flora of the Southern United States, page 50, published in 1860. So you can go back and find right where the first reference of it was. And then I mentioned there's a type specimen. Well, this is a herbarium specimen, standard size paper, about so by so. And here's the label in the lower right-hand corner. And this is the plant that Chapman, the actual specimen of the plant that Chapman had in mind when he first used this name. And if you look at a close-up of his label, he was one who was very sparse with the information he would put on the label. So this one just says Florida. Sometimes you can get a very detailed description, go right back to a place and collect the plant where the collector was. But this was the label from his herbarium, and this little asterisk means that this is a specimen that he cited in his southern Flora. And he wrote that he wasn't really that interested in naming new plants, and that he would kind of leave a lot of that to other people, but he always did collect an example of what he had in mind. And so I think he didn't pay that much attention to the labels because he wasn't thinking about posterity. All right, so here's another plant that Chapman named, white birds in a nest. This one, quite a different distribution, only found in the counties right around here. It's a wonderful plant. I don't know how many of you have seen this in the wild, but in the mint family, and this is the nest and the birds. This is the inflorescence, or the flowers. The flowers in bud are the eggs, and then these are like baby birds with their mouths open. Those are the outside of the petals there. So it's a very cool plant. And Chapman described it in his Flora. Again, a new species in the mint family. And here's the herbarium specimen for it. And here's the label. And it just says Florida again, right? McBridia, a new species by Chapman. Here's one more species that he named, this white meadow beauty. And here's, he listed it in his, published it in his 3rd edition. Here's the herbarium specimen for that. And here's what the label looks like, which is a little bit more information. Apalachicola, Florida, that's where he collected it in 1898. Remember, he died in 1899, so he was still a spry guy at these ages. And his herbarium specimens, some specimens he mailed contemporaneously at the time to New York to Torrey or Gray, but others of them he collected and kept for himself, and subsequently they were purchased by major institutions. This one is at the Missouri Botanical Garden, and his collections went to several different places, and I read that he was compelled to sell his collection because he invested money with a friend and lost all his savings. So he had to sell his specimens. That was sad, but then they were well preserved and are still available. So those are examples of plants that Chapman named, but plants also have been named after Chapman. So the author of a new plant can choose whatever name she wants as long as it's not already in use. Remember I said that was the rule. So specific epithets, as I mentioned, often reveal something about the traits or the biogeography of the plant, but they don't have to. Authors sometimes name a plant after the person who first collected it, right, or to pay tribute to another botanist. So people paid tribute to Chapman. Talk about an example here. Chapman's blazing star, Pleiotris chapmanii. It was named by Torrey and Gray, the aforementioned Torrey and Gray, in one of their publications. And here is the publication. And Torrey and Gray in 1843 named it, it's from the Sandhills of Middle Florida, and they named it based on a specimen that Chapman had sent to them. So they were naming it Chapmanii because Chapman had first collected it. And these was just some examples. His correspondence, Chapman's with Torrey and some with Gray, is available at the Biodiversity Heritage Library. And he sent specimens up to New York to be examined by these experts, and you can see lists of what he sent. And this was a letter that he wrote to Tori, and I love the way the rich writing, effusive writing that people used in the past. But at the end of his letter he closed, I received with the liveliest emotions the compliments that you have paid me. This is Chapman to Tori. And rest assured, if my exertions have added to the pleasure of your life, or should have advanced in any measure the cause of the science that you have espoused, any reward secured, and my happiness will be complete. I remain, sir, yours as ever, Alan Chapman. And here's the type specimen of that species, and it was collected between Tallahassee and St. Mark's. It says another species named in honor of Chapman was Chapman's oak, which gets all over Florida, as you can see. Here's the type specimen of that, and here is where it was first published by a fellow named Sargent in the journal Garden and Forest, and here's the tribute there. So I wish to call this Quercus chapmanii to honor the author of the Flora of the Southern United States who first distinguished it. So he had made reference to this plant in his work, and there's one genus that's been named in honor of Chapman by Torrey and Gray, Chapmanii floridana. And here they published in a paper that they had in 1838 this genus name, and their attribute is, we dedicate this interesting genus to our friend Dr. W.A. Chapman, an accurate and indefatigable botanist who has largely contributed to our knowledge of the plants of Middle Florida. So there's
That was when, 1838?
What did I say?
Yep, 1838.
And here I'm going to mention just a few of the other plants that have been named in his honor. And this one I put in because it's a cool plant, but also because it was first described as new to science in 1972, based on some descriptions that Chapman had written back in the day. So just as an example of how the process of name changing is, naming of plants is fluid and what's going on. And here, how about this jump, is another plant named in honor of Chapman with a very localized distribution in North Florida and possible sites in Texas. Chapman's milkwort. So let's look at pictures of plants. So we got a few plant pictures in here. Chapman's rhododendron, which I was lucky enough to be able to go out and see Thursday at the St. Jove Buffer Preserve in bloom. Thank you, Jim Paulson in the audience, for taking this photo and sharing it with me. It's a gorgeous azalea-like looking rhododendron flower, and I'll share a little story about this here in a few minutes when I do some reading. I'm finishing up, but I wanted to mention that I have been working with some folks in this room who are interested in getting more of these plants that are associated with Chapman present at his namesake garden. So I have a list over here. If any of you are interested in being involved in any way with that, we're like trying to get ideas, and we just want to make that space a better or more of a tribute to Chapman's plants that are related to his legacy. Okay, well, if I could have the lights, please. I wanted to finish with just a couple of, reading from a couple of tributes and to Chapman about things that just really resonated with me as a botanist, and I thought, oh yeah, I get it, I totally get it. But This I thought was pretty interesting. This is from a tribute after he died, written by John Rouge, Apalachicola. This is the only place I read this anecdote, which I thought was pretty interesting. While at Amherst, he, which was Chapman, was a leader in the choir. I think he sang in the choir here at Trinity as well. And during his college course, through his devotion and loyalty to a friend, had an escapade which caused him, for conscientious reasons, to temporarily leave college. But the president sent for him soon and urged his return. So I would love to know what the escapade was. I don't know. Then in Gail Fishman's book that I referenced, she reported on an interesting excerpt from one of his letters, which I had come across and read too. And this kind of goes under the heading of the hazards of field work. Okay? So, March 15th, 1841, the doctor mentioned that the Apalachicola River was high and boxes awaiting a northbound ship were stored in a warehouse, now almost underwater. Okay, we can all relate to that, living in this area. And he reminded Torrey that he was on the frontier and the Indians hold undisturbed possession of the county between me and the Gulf. It is as much as my neck is worth to venture down there. Although parts of this county have been settled since 1825, yet no white person to my knowledge has ever traversed that unknown region, and you can imagine my anxiety. A near encounter in 1841 reinforced his decision to avoid the wilderness between himself and the coast. Last summer, I went down to the lower part of the country to get some rhododendron. The whole country is a perfect wilderness where deep swamps and dry sand ridges alternate. I rode to one of the larger creeks and then took it on foot through a swamp nearly a mile wide. In this swamp, I found a moccasin track. Okay. Now, when I first read that, I thought, water moccasin, cottonmouth. That would be scary if you're way out remote in a place all by yourself, but that's not actually what he's talking about. As it did not appear recent, I ventured on some 5 miles further, and to my great mortification, I could not find the spot where I had seen it before. The next day, some hunters on the frontier fell upon 13 Indians, 3 of whom they killed. It seemed that they had found my trail and were following me into the frontier. I need not say that that was my last visit to the region. So there were a lot of unrest and skirmishes with Native Americans at that time. In another tribute by Charles Moore, said, Dr. Chapman was in every respect a perfectly normally constituted man of fine physique and dignified appearance, robust in health and vigorous and of an untiring activity which he retained almost unimpaired to the end of his years. He was remarkably free from interruptions by the ills man is generally heir to. The following incidents might serve as an illustration of the great physical and mental energy by which he was animated after he had already passed by several years the 8th decade of his life, and which will be cherished in the memory of the writer. When the deceased presented to me specimens of the beautiful and rare orchid, Calopogon multiflorus, he dictated a note be made on the label, collected by A.W. Chapman, walking 13 miles for this plant in his 83rd year. In the fall of 1895, he accompanied the writer on a tedious trip made in a small skiff many miles up the Apalachicola River in search of an obscure ash which he had observed 30 years before but had not encountered afterwards. This he at once pointed out again, and in March 1896 he joined Professor Sargent and the writer on a trip in a towboat to the same localities. During the whole day spent in an almost inaccessible palmetto and cypress swamp, our aged companion showed the alacrity of a botanical collector in his best years of life. And another tribute on the completion of the revised edition of the Flora, and under the burden of more than 80 years, it may be thought that Dr. Chapman would have abandoned active botanical work, but not so. Each season saw him eager in the field to look for new facts and gather new species. Not many years since, To further the work of a much younger man, he went into the woods 100 miles from his home in midwinter and made an extensive collection of woody plants in their resting state, finding, he wrote, no little pleasure, that means a lot of pleasure, in making the acquaintance of many old friend plants in an unwanton guise, that is, an unaccustomed guise, and several of the larger herbaria are enriched by the fruit of his work in the field during the last 5 years of his life. So it tended to be that when people were collecting specimens, they collect, if you wanted to identify a tree, it would have leaves on it, right? So it would be like summer specimens or plants with flowers. So it was, showed his depth of expertise and interest that he would go out and collect plants in winter. Then the final couple of readings are from this amazing and very vividly written tribute by Winifred Kimball, who was a young woman from New York who moved down here with her family, and she's a historian herself as well. But she wrote about her times with Chapman. They came here in 1887, and she said, "We built a home and my mother planted a garden. Oh, what a delightful time she and the doctor did have, experimenting with impossibilities. When a South American ship brought up clay from the Rio de Plata as ballast, and my father had it spread over the garden, he watched each new weed that cropped up. It was about this time that I began to study botany with him and to accompany him on his long jaunts through the pine woods and deep into the tai-tai swamps." And she said that Chapman said, I did not do much botanical work in those days, the doctor would say. I was too busy doctoring. Still, dear madam, there is a lot of pother in this doctoring. I can find that my deafness is not entirely detrimental, since if I can't hear people's groans, they won't send for me. My flowers are far more satisfactory. That reminds me, if people did but know it, fresh air and sunshine, just what keeps the plants growing, will keep most of us well. Why, unless it was a case of easing a soul in or out of this world, I did my best practice with hot baths and bread pills. Dr. Gray visited Dr. Chapman down here. This was before our acquaintance began, but I have heard him tell this story of his friend's visit. I have been writing Gray that I found a new rhododendron, and between you and me, I really think this is the plant that brought him south. Anyway, we went after it. Fortunately, he came early enough to catch the pretty witch in bloom. I took him out to the reaches where the flower grew. It always looked white to me, but Gray said it blushed pink. He looked at it for several moments, then he knelt down and studied it closely. When he rose, he came over and offered me his hand. "You are right," he said. "I have never seen this species. I congratulate you on Rhododendron chapmanii." This incident brings to me a peculiarity of the doctor's sight, which was a great cross to him. He could not detect the color red in any of its shades. Blue was perfect, but a red rose for him was so dull that it looked like a dusky brown, and the pinks were all white. This failing was the cause of many of our interviews, for he always came to my mother or to me to have his flowers described in shade and hue. And one final thing. When I survey my acquaintance with Dr. Chapman, I am impressed with the sweetness of it all. Never a thing to repel you, yet he has been called a very stern and haughty man. He was not. Only if you interest yourself with plants and flowers and all the teeming life of the world, you have little time for the pettiness of people. He lived and gave himself to his profession and a few close friends. To the rest of the town, his deafness served as an excuse for an isolation that he welcomed. Read them? So, with that, I'm going to finish up, and we'd be happy to take questions or comments or other stories about Chapman.
When you told me yesterday, or day before yesterday, that Gray visited Chapman, how the heck did he get here? There was no train track right to Apalachicola. How did someone from...
Steamboats.
And he, all the way around Florida?
No, I think, okay, so you're historians, that's out of my league, but steamboats, but I think they, maybe they went to New Orleans. and went up the Mississippi. And then from the Mississippi to the Ohio, and that's how I got into Louisville.
Because that was a long trip for Gray
Or
to Maine.
boat, by boat,
Yeah.
maybe, around the coast.
From Boston, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they would sail down along the coast, down past Key West and up.
They would go,
All the way down.
across the peninsula, they would go
Yeah, all the way down.
all the way down, all the way back up.
Yeah, if
Wow.
they took a clipper ship, that's how they went.
Yep, I remember reading about Kroom of Victoria fame who drowned, right, with his family on a sailing like back and forth from New York. Yeah, somebody, Captain?
Yeah, Becky, have you seen the first two white plants, the albas, the Microdia alba? Have you seen those here?
I have not. I've seen the Rexia, the second one, but I have not.
Jim has?
I saw, yeah, up in the forest, yeah.
But
That's so cool.
for people that are interested, I am trying to see if we can launch a series of field trips to go see Chapman plants. So I would love to see that plant, and I never have. I've been in areas where people thought we might see it, but it hadn't been available, or it didn't show up.
I was wondering if Chapman used any of John Bartram's writings or research in any of his studies.
Yes, certainly Bartram had early travels that he wrote about, but I haven't seen any reference to that. And I don't know what was in Chapman's library. So I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone have an opinion who are more Florida historians than me?
Do you know what happened to his library? Was his library left?
It was purchased by, we read that.
Well, the herbarium, some went to different places. Some things were purchased by the Biltmore estate
Biltmore.
and Vanderbilt's. And I read that Chapman was happy with that because he thought they'd stay in the South then. But I think those collections ended up at New York Botanical Garden. I think the herbarium there. But I don't know about influence or connection with Bartram, but that's an interesting idea. See if I can find out.
Well, you certainly did a lot of research. It was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, and I've always worked with plants and worked in greenhouses, but I learned so much today about especially the naming of plants. And I appreciate all that detail.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. I find it interesting, and not every audience does. But anyway, thank you very much. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the guy who his book is about Perea being the biblical Garden of Eden?
Okay. Now there's a little bit, and there's a natural area up there called Garden of Eden, right? And up Blountstown.
There's two different places, but the reason I bring it up if you're familiar, because I was reading his book recently, and he's got a list of all the plants that were in the Bible.
Okay.
And then he's got a list of all the plants that are up there. And they're not anywhere else was his point. So, because you're constantly hearing down here, there's so much diversity. The Apalachicola River in different places.
Well, that's interesting. My question would be, though, about common name usage in the Bible and how you connect that with binomial Latin names, which are Latinized because it's universal language, and common names can mean so many different things in different places or to different people. So, but that's interesting too.
Do you know how old he was when he became deaf?
No, I don't know that. It seems to have been in his later life, but when he lived to be 90, I don't know. His later life might have been
So he was
youngish, like in his 60s. I don't know.
Just to bring in sort of a political thing, he was a Yankee, and he sided with the Yankees during the war. And when Confederate soldiers would come through Apalachicola, which was not that much, he would sleep in Trinity Episcopal Church because he thought it was safer. And also the blockade boats that blockaded the mouth of the river would come ashore and find him and ask him questions about things that had happened. They heard about the explosion of the Chattahoochee, the big steam, big military boat that was being built for the Confederacy, whose boilers exploded like on its maiden voyage. They came ashore and talked to him about that. And you can actually read in the communications between the U.S. Navy boats and their commanding officers, they mention him. And it's a searchable text. You can go find where he talked to them.
It was interesting too, I read that he and his wife had different opinions. She was a Southerner, and I think she went back home to Mariana, where she was from during the war, and they split for a while.
Thank you so
Yeah, well, thank you for that. There's more
much.
questions out
Please avail yourself of some of these cookies, because I need them to leave the building.